She was wearing a dress from a thrift store, clutching a terrified invitation in her hand. Everyone else at the Harrington wedding was dripping in diamonds, arriving in limousines that cost more than a house. But when Naomi walked in, looking for her seat, the bride's mother didn't just snub her. She pointed a manicured finger toward the kitchen doors. "The help eats in the back," she sneered, loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear. Naomi didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just quietly took her seat next to the dishwasher. What none of them knew, not the arrogant bride, not the laughing guests, was that the helicopter landing on the lawn 5 minutes later wasn't for the groom. It was for Naomi, and the man stepping out of it was about to buy the entire hotel just to fire the woman who insulted his wife. This is the story of the mistake that cost a socialite everything. The invitation weighed heavy in Naomi Vance's purse, a thick, cream-colored card embossed with gold leaf that felt like it cost more than her entire outfit. The venue was the Château de Lumière, a sprawling estate on the edge of the cliffs in Newport, rented out for the wedding of the century between Julian Thorne, a man Naomi had known since he was in diapers, and Victoria St. James, a woman whose reputation for cruelty was only eclipsed by her trust fund. Naomi adjusted the hem of her dress. It was a simple, soft blue linen. No sequins, no plunging neckline, just modest. She had bought it off the rack at a department store 3 years ago. To anyone else here, surrounded by custom Versace and vintage Chanel, she looked like she had wandered in from a bus stop. She checked her phone. No messages. He's going to be late, she thought, a knot tightening in her stomach. Alexander is always late. Her husband, Alexander, had promised he'd meet her there. "Just go in, Elle," he had texted an hour ago. "My meeting with the board in Tokyo ran over. I'm landing the chopper nearby. Don't let Aunt Margot bully you." Easy for him to say. Alexander wasn't the one walking into a den of vipers alone. As Naomi approached the entrance, the air smelled of expensive perfume and judgment. The wedding coordinator, a frantic man with a headset, glanced at her up and down, his lip curling slightly. "Name?" he barked, not bothering to look up from his clipboard. "Naomi Vance," she said softly. She didn't use her married name. She never did. She liked keeping things simple, and Vance was the name on her teaching certificate. The coordinator scanned the list. Vance. He stopped. He looked at her again, this time with a confused squint. "You're on the list. Table 1. Naomi blinked. Table 1? Usually, table 1 was the head table, the family table. That seemed generous. Maybe Julian had insisted on it. They had been childhood friends, after all, long before Julian became a hedge fund manager, and Naomi became, well, whatever the world thought she was. She stepped into the ballroom. It was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling. A string quartet played Debussy in the corner. But as Naomi began to walk toward the front of the room, where table 1 usually sat, a hand shot out and grabbed her arm. It was Margot St. James, the mother of the bride. Margot was a terrifying woman, encased in a silver gown that looked like armor. Her face was pulled so tight by surgery that her smile looked painful. "Excuse me," Margot hissed, her voice dripping with ice. "Where do you think you're going?" Naomi flinched, pulling her arm back. I was told table 1, Margot. It's Naomi, Julian's friend." Margot laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound. "Oh, I know who you are, dear. The little school teacher. Julian's charity case." She looked around to ensure an audience was watching. A few bridesmaids, sipping champagne, giggled behind their hands. "There has been a rearrangement," Margot said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "We can't have clutter at the head table. It ruins the aesthetic for the Vogue photographer." Naomi felt the heat rise to her cheeks. Clutter? Yes. Look at you. Margot gestured vaguely at Naomi's linen dress. You look like you're here to refill the water glasses. Honestly, it's embarrassing for Victoria. We have senators here. We have oil tycoons. We can't have you sitting next to the groom. Julian invited me, Naomi said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. He's my oldest friend. Julian is a married man now, Margot snapped. He doesn't need anchor weights from his past dragging him down. You want to stay? Fine, but you won't be at table 1. Margot snapped her fingers at a passing waiter. Take this woman to table 99. The waiter hesitated. Ma'am, table 99 is... That's the vendor table, in the service alcove, by the swinging doors. Did I stutter? Margot glared at him. Then she turned her cold, dead eyes back to Naomi. It's where you belong, isn't it? With the staff. You can eat when they take their breaks. Try not to steal the silverware. The bridesmaids erupted into laughter. Naomi stood there, frozen. She could have left. She could have turned around, walked out, and called Alexander to tell him to turn the helicopter around. But Naomi Vance was many things. Quiet, modest, kind. But she was not a coward, and she knew something Margot didn't. She knew exactly who was coming to pick her up. Fine, Naomi said, lifting her chin. Table 99. She walked past the snickering socialites, head held high, straight toward the kitchen doors. Table 99 wasn't even a real table. It was a folding card table set up behind a decorative fern, right next to the double doors where servers were rushing in and out with trays of filet mignon. The draft from the kitchen smelled of dish soap and old grease. There were 3 other people sitting there. One was the wedding photographer's assistant, a young guy named Leo who looked exhausted. Another was the nanny for one of the guests, rocking a sleeping baby, and the third was an older man in a security uniform, nursing a glass of lukewarm water. Welcome to the VIP section, the security guard grunted, as Naomi pulled out a metal folding chair. I'm Frank. Naomi, she said, sitting down. Nice dress, the photographer's assistant, Leo, said sarcastically, eyeing her linen outfit. Did you forget your apron, or are you the new dishwasher? Apparently I'm clutter, Naomi said, forcing a smile. She picked up the plastic cup of water at her place setting. There was no wine here, no crystal glasses, just the noise of the kitchen and the distant sound of laughter from the ballroom. From her vantage point behind the fern, she could see the head table. She saw Julian, the groom, looking around anxiously. He whispered something to Margot. Margot patted his hand and pointed toward the door, lying through her teeth. Julian slumped back in his chair, looking defeated. First time getting snubbed by the St. James family? Frank asked, leaning back. Not exactly, Naomi sighed. But definitely the most public. Don't worry, Frank said, checking his watch. Rich folks are miserable. Look at them. He pointed a thick finger through the leaves of the fern. See that guy? The one in the grey suit screaming at the waiter. That's Senator Miller. He's bankrupt. Bounced a check for his security detail last week. And her? He pointed at Margot. She's leveraging this wedding to pay off her gambling debts in Monaco. It's all fake, kid. All of it. Naomi looked at Frank with new interest. You seem to know a lot. I'm head of security for the venue, Frank shrugged. I see everything. I also know that you don't look like you belong at this table. You carry yourself different. You walk like you own the place, but you dress like you don't care who owns it. Naomi smiled. My husband likes to say that money talks but wealth whispers. Frank chuckled. Smart man. Where is he? Did they shove him in the coat check? He's running late, Naomi said. She glanced at her phone again. 15 minutes out, the text read. Prepare for arrival. Just then, the swinging doors burst open. Margot St. James marched into the service alcove, looking furious. She spotted Naomi sipping her water. "You!" Margot barked. "Get up." Naomi set her cup down slowly. "Is there a problem, Margot?" One of the servers dropped a tray of appetizers. "We're short-staffed," Margot demanded, her face flushed. "Grab a towel and help clean it up. If you're going to sit with the help, you might as well be useful." The table went silent. Leo's jaw dropped. Frank, the security guard, stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Mrs. St. James, you can't ask a guest to—" "She's not a guest," Margot shrieked. "She's a nobody, a teacher, and right now, she's taking up space. Clean up the mess, Naomi, or I will have security throw you out into the parking lot." Naomi looked at the towel Margot had thrown onto the table. It was stained and dirty. Slowly, Naomi stood up. The room went quiet as the nearby staff stopped to watch. "You want me to clean?" Naomi asked, her voice calm, dangerously low. "I want you to know your place," Margot spat. Naomi picked up the towel. She looked at it, then looked at Margot. "I know my place, Margot," Naomi said. "Do you know yours?" "Excuse me?" "You're right," Naomi said, dropping the towel back onto the table. "I shouldn't be sitting here. This table is for the hard-working staff who actually make this place run. People with dignity. You don't have any," Margot gasped. "Frank, throw her out, now!" Frank crossed his arms. "Sorry, Mum. She hasn't caused a disturbance. You have." "I will have your job," Margot screamed. "I will have you fired. I will buy this security company and fire you myself." Frank smirked. "Good luck with that. The company is owned by the Blackwood Group. They don't sell to people with credit scores like yours." At the mention of the Blackwood Group, the entire room seemed to freeze. Even Margot paled slightly. The Blackwood Group was the conglomerate that practically owned the eastern seaboard. Hotels, security firms, tech giants. The CEO, Alexander Blackwood, was a ghost, a recluse, a billionaire who was never seen in public. "I don't care who owns it," Margot shrieked, losing control. "Get her out of my sight!" Suddenly, a low, thumping sound began to vibrate the windows. It started soft, a rhythmic thwap, 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 and grew louder, shaking the silverware on the folding table. The crystal glasses in the main ballroom started to tingle. The guests inside the ballroom stopped eating. The music died down. "What is that?" Leo asked, looking up at the ceiling. Naomi smiled. She checked her watch. Right on time. The double doors to the outside terrace flew open as a gust of wind swept through the service alcove, blowing napkins off the table. Through the glass, everyone saw it. A sleek, black, military-grade helicopter was descending onto the great lawn, right in the middle of the perfectly manicured rose garden. The rotors were kicking up a storm of petals, ruining the outdoor setup. The side of the helicopter bore a logo in gold, a simple, elegant B. Margot ran to the window, her mouth open. "Who dares land on my lawn? Who is ruining my reception?" Naomi picked up her purse. She smoothed down her simple blue linen dress. "That," Naomi said, stepping around the stunned Margot, "would be my ride." She walked past the frozen staff, past the horrified Margot, and pushed open the doors into the main ballroom. The real show was just beginning. The noise was deafening. The blades of the helicopter, a Sikorsky S-76 in matte black, sliced through the humid Newport air, whipping the perfectly arranged floral arches into a frenzy of flying petals. Waiters ducked, shielding their trays. Guests in the ballroom pressed their faces against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, their mouths agape, phones recording the spectacle. Margot St. James was screaming, but the sound of the rotors swallowed her voice. She looked like a deranged banshee, her silver dress whipping around her legs as she stumbled out onto the terrace, heels sinking into the grass. "Stop this! Stop this immediately!" she shrieked at the machine, waving her arms. "I will sue you! Do you know who I am?" The helicopter engine began to whine down, the blades slowing to a lazy, rhythmic whoosh. A side door slid open with a smooth mechanical hiss. First, a bodyguard stepped out. He was massive, wearing an earpiece and a suit that strained against his shoulders. He scanned the perimeter with the efficiency of a man who expected threats. Then, he turned and offered a hand to the man inside. A hush fell over the terrace. Even Margot stopped screaming, her breath catching in her throat. The man who stepped onto the grass was tall, over 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out a tuxedo, cut so precisely it looked like a second skin. He had dark hair, slightly windblown, and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that terrified people. They were cold, calculating, and utterly indifferent to the chaos he had just caused. He adjusted his cufflinks, platinum, inlaid with black onyx, and surveyed the terrified wedding party as if they were insects he had accidentally stepped on. "You!" Margot marched up to him, though she stopped 3 feet away when the bodyguard shifted slightly. "Who do you think you are? You've ruined the arrival of the cake. This is private property." The man didn't even look at her. He looked past her, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching. "I'm looking for my wife," he said. His voice was a deep baritone that carried effortlessly over the dying wind of the rotors. It wasn't a question. It was a command. Margot blinked, thrown off balance. "Your wife? There are no wives here who belong to people like you. This is the St. James wedding. Unless she's on the catering staff, she isn't here." The man finally looked at Margot. The temperature on the terrace seemed to drop 10 degrees. "If she is on the catering staff," the man said softly, "then I am going to burn this building to the ground." Inside the ballroom, Naomi watched through the glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the way Margot shrank back. She saw the fear in the eyes of the guests who were starting to recognize him. "Holy..." Leo, the photographer's assistant, whispered beside her. He was zooming in with his camera lens. Is that Alexander Blackwood?" "Who?" Frank the security guard asked, squinting. "Alexander Blackwood," Leo hissed. "The venture capitalist. The guy who bought half of Tokyo's tech sector last month. They call him the Wolf of Wall Street's nightmare. He's worth more than this entire zip code." Frank looked at Naomi. His eyes went wide. "Naomi, you said your husband's name was Alexander." Naomi sighed, smoothing her skirt. "He can be a bit dramatic." She pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the windy terrace. The moment she appeared, Alexander's gaze snapped to her. The cold, predator look vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound relief and adoration that shocked everyone watching. He ignored Margot, walked right past the trembling groomsmen, and closed the distance to Naomi in 3 long strides. "You're late," Naomi said, crossing her arms, though a small smile played on her lips. "Traffic," Alexander said, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "And the pilot was afraid of the hydrangeas. I told him to land on them." He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a polite, social peck. It was a claim. He kissed her like he hadn't seen her in years, right in front of the stunned elite of Newport. When he pulled back, he kept his hand on her waist, pulling her flush against his expensive tuxedo. "I missed you," he murmured. Then his eyes narrowed as he looked at her dress. He frowned. "Why are you out here? Why aren't you inside at the table?" Naomi hesitated. She looked at Margot, who was now pale as a sheet. "There was a complication with the seating," Naomi said diplomatically. Alexander turned slowly to face Margot. The tenderness was gone. The wolf was back. "Margot St. James," Alexander said, recognizing her now. "I assume you have a good explanation for why my wife was standing in the service alcove when I landed." Margot's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I didn't know. Naomi never said. She just said she was a teacher." "She is a teacher," Alexander said, his voice dangerously calm. "She teaches because she loves it, not because she has to, and she is also Mrs. Naomi Blackwood." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. The whispers started instantly like a wildfire. "Blackwood! That's Naomi Blackwood! The billionaire's wife? The one nobody has ever seen? Oh my God, Margot treated her like a maid." Alexander scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Julian, the groom. Julian was standing by the champagne tower, looking like he wanted to vomit. "Julian," Alexander said, nodding. "Old friend, I see you've done well for yourself, marrying into the St. James family." "Alex," Julian stammered, walking forward with a nervous laugh. I had no idea you were coming. Naomi said, well, she didn't mention you were the Alexander." "I wanted to surprise you," Alexander said dryly, "but it seems the surprise is on me." Alexander looked around the terrace. "So, where are we sitting?" "I'm starving." Margot suddenly snapped out of her trance. Her social survival instincts kicked in. She forced a bright, terrifyingly fake smile. "Table 1, she chirped, clapping her hands. "Of course, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. We have 2 seats right next to the senator. Please, Mr. Blackwood, right this way. The champagne is vintage Dom Perignon." She gestured toward the grand doors, trying to usher them in like royalty. Alexander didn't move. He looked down at Naomi. "Is that where you were sitting, Elle? Table 1? Naomi looked at the floor. She hated conflict. She just wanted to go home. But then she remembered the towel. She remembered the sneer. "Clean up the mess, Naomi." She looked up at her husband. "No," she said softly. "I wasn't at table 1. Alexander's hand tightened on her waist. "Where were you?" Naomi pointed a shaking finger back toward the service alcove, toward the folding table behind the fern. "I was at table 99, she whispered, "with the staff, next to the kitchen door." The silence that followed was absolute. The string quartet had stopped playing. The wind had died down. The only sound was the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Alexander Blackwood stared at the service alcove. He looked at the cheap folding table. He saw the dirty towel still lying where Naomi had dropped it. He saw Frank, the security guard, and Leo, the assistant, standing there, looking awkward. Then he looked at Margot. If looks could kill, Margot St. James would have disintegrated into dust. "You made my wife sit in the kitchen?" Alexander asked. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried more weight than a scream. It was a mistake," Margot stammered, backing away. "The seating chart, the wedding planner, he messed it up. I told him, 'Liar!'" A deep voice rumbled from the alcove. Everyone turned. It was Frank. Frank stepped out from behind the fern, adjusting his belt. He looked terrified to be speaking up, but he looked at Naomi, and then he looked at Margot, and he squared his shoulders. "She didn't mess up the chart," Frank said, addressing Alexander directly. "She told Mrs. Blackwood that she was clutter. She told her she belonged with the help. She even tried to make her clean up a spill on the floor right before you landed." Alexander closed his eyes. He took a deep breath through his nose. When he opened them, they were pitch black. He released Naomi's waist and took a step toward Margot. "Is this true?" he asked. Margot looked around for support, but her friends The socialites, the tycoons, were all looking away, studying their shoes or their drinks. No one wanted to be in the blast radius of what was coming. She was dressed poorly, Margot blurted out, her defense crumbling into pure elitism. Look at her. How was I supposed to know she was someone? She came in wearing linen. She looked like a nobody. A nobody, Alexander repeated. He laughed. It was a cold, terrifying sound. Margot, the dress she is wearing is a custom linen blend from a boutique in Amalfi. It costs more than your wedding cake. But you wouldn't know that, because you don't know quality. You only know price tags. He turned to Julian. Julian, Alexander said, we grew up together. I helped you with your calculus homework. I invested in your first hedge fund when everyone else laughed at you. Did you know about this? Julian looked pale. Alex, I saw her come in. Margot said she handled it. I didn't want to cause a scene. You didn't want to cause a scene, Alexander repeated. So you let your mother-in-law treat my wife like a servant. Alexander reached into his tuxedo jacket. For a second, the bodyguard tensed and the guests flinched. But Alexander simply pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. He tapped the screen 3 times. What are you doing? Margot whispered, trembling. I'm making a call, Alexander said calmly. Put it on speaker. He held the phone up. It rang once. Mr. Blackwood, a crisp voice answered. This is unexpected. Is everything all right with the flight? Charles, Alexander said. I'm currently at the Chateau de Lumière in Newport. Who holds the mortgage on this property? The guests gasped. The chateau was the jewel of Newport. There was the sound of typing on the other end. One moment, sir. It appears the property is owned by a holding company, St. James Estates, but the mortgage is heavily leveraged. It's held by First National Bank of Providence. And who owns First National? Alexander asked, staring directly at Margot. We do, sir, Charles replied. Blackwood Holdings acquired them in the merger last quarter. Margot grabbed the edge of a table to steady herself. Her face was grey. Excellent, Alexander said. Call the bank manager. Tell him I want to call in the loan on the chateau. Immediately. If they can't pay the full principal by, let's say, midnight. I want foreclosure proceedings to begin at 12:01 a.m. Understood, sir. Initiating now. Alexander hung up. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. You can't do that, Margot shrieked. This is my family's legacy. We have the wedding reception here. You can't foreclose on us in the middle of a wedding. Actually, I can, Alexander said coolly. It's in the fine print. Acceleration clause due to reputational risk. And frankly, Margot, associating with you is a massive risk to my reputation. He turned back to Naomi, his face softening again. Now, Alexander said, offering her his arm. I don't think we'll be staying for the chicken. I heard there's a wonderful diner down the coast that serves burgers. Would you prefer that? Naomi looked at Margot, who was now weeping into her hands. She looked at Julian, who was staring at the ground in shame. She looked at the guests, who were looking at her with a mix of awe and terror. She took Alexander's arm. A burger sounds perfect, she said. Wait! It was Frank. The security guard walked up to them, looking nervous. Mr. Blackwood, Frank said. I just wanted to say, your wife is a class act. She treated us like people. That's more than I can say for anyone else here. Alexander looked at Frank. He looked at the name tag on his uniform. Frank, Alexander said. How long have you worked here? 20 years, sir. Do you like it? Frank grimaced. Well, the benefits aren't great. And the clientele, well, you see. Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. It was heavy, black metal with gold lettering. I need a new head of security for my estate in the Hamptons, Alexander said. The pay is triple what you make here, full benefits, and the only person you have to answer to is Naomi. If she says you're good people, that's enough for me. Frank stared at the card. His hands shook as he took it. Sir, Thank you. Bring the photographer kid too, Alexander added, nodding at Leo. We need someone to take pictures of the dogs. Alexander turned to leave, pulling Naomi with him toward the helicopter. But just as they reached the steps, a voice rang out. Wait, please, you can't just leave. It was Victoria, the bride. She had finally come out of the ballroom. She looked furious but also terrified. She wasn't looking at Alexander. She was looking at Naomi. You ruined my wedding, Victoria screamed, stomping her foot. You came here on purpose to ruin my day. You're just jealous because Julian chose me. Naomi stopped. She let go of Alexander's arm and turned around. The wind from the ocean caught her hair. She didn't look like a teacher anymore. She looked like a queen who had been hiding in plain sight. Victoria, Naomi said, her voice carrying across the lawn. I didn't come here to ruin anything. I came to wish an old friend happiness. But you need to understand something. She stepped closer to the bride. Happiness isn't a castle, Naomi said, and it certainly isn't a seating chart. You have all of this. She gestured to the mansion, the flowers, the guests, and yet you're so insecure you had to put me in the kitchen to feel big. Naomi smiled, but it was a sad smile. I don't need to ruin your wedding, Victoria. You've already done that yourself. She turned back to Alexander. Let's go. They climbed into the helicopter. As the rotors began to spin, kicking up the wind again, the guests watched in silence. The bee on the side of the helicopter gleamed in the setting sun. As they lifted off, banking sharply over the ocean, Margot St. James collapsed into a chair, her phone ringing endlessly with calls from the bank. But the story wasn't over. Because Alexander Blackwood was a man who believed in thoroughness, and he wasn't done with the St. James family just yet. The sun rose over Newport the next morning, bathing the coastline in a deceptive golden light. But inside the Château de Lumière, the mood was apocalyptic. Margot St. James had not slept. She sat at the long mahogany dining table in her silk robe, staring at her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her coffee cup. The wedding reception had dissolved into chaos after the helicopter left. Half the guests, the ones who actually mattered, the senators and the CEOs, had quietly slipped away, not wanting to be associated with a family that Alexander Blackwood had publicly declared war on. The other half had stayed only to gossip, whispering behind their hands, while Victoria sobbed into her wedding cake. But the social humiliation was nothing compared to the financial reality that greeted Margot at 7 a.m. A sharp knock echoed through the foyer. Margot stood up, tightening her robe. "Rosie," she called out for the housekeeper. "Answer the door." There was no answer. "Rosie." Margot marched into the hallway. The house was silent. The kitchen was empty. There was no breakfast cooking on the stove. On the marble counter sat a neatly folded uniform and a note. "Mrs. St. James, I saw the news. My nephew follows the Blackwood accounts. He says the bank is seizing the assets. I can't work for free. I've gone to the agency." Rosie Margot crumbled the note, her face turning red. "Ungrateful. I'll ruin her reference." The knocking came again, louder this time, more authoritative. Margot threw open the heavy oak front doors. Standing on the porch were 3 men in dark suits, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy. "Margot St. James?" the lead suit asked. He didn't smile. "Yes. Who are you? It's 7 a.m. "I'm with the Asset Recovery Division of First National Bank of Providence," the man said, holding up a clipboard. As per the conversation last night between the majority shareholder and the branch manager, the loan on this property has been called due to a breach of the reputational solvency clause. That's ridiculous, Margot spat. I'll call my lawyer. You can certainly do that, ma'am, the agent said calmly. But according to our records, your retainer check to the firm of Holloway and Partners bounced this morning. They've dropped you as a client. Margot felt the blood drain from her face. Bounced? That's impossible. We have millions in the trust. The trust was leveraged against the house, the agent interrupted, stepping forward. And since the house is underwater, the trust is frozen. Ma'am, we are here to secure the premises. You have 24 hours to vacate the property before we change the locks. Vacate? Margot shrieked. This is my home. My daughter just got married yesterday. She's upstairs. Then I suggest she starts packing, the deputy said dryly. As if on cue, Victoria appeared at the top of the grand staircase, still wearing her reception dress, her makeup smeared. Mother? She croaked. Why has my credit card declined? I tried to book the honeymoon flight to the Maldives, and it said insufficient funds. Margot looked at her daughter. She looked at the bank agents. The walls of her carefully constructed life were collapsing, brick by brick. But the final blow came from the internet. Victoria walked down the stairs, staring at her phone. Mum, have you seen TikTok? I don't care about TikTok, Margot screamed. You should, Victoria whispered, turning the screen toward her mother. It was a video taken by a guest, likely from the service alcove. It showed Margot, face twisted in a sneer, pointing at the kitchen door. The audio was crystal clear. You look like you're here to refill the water glasses. The help eats in the back. The video had 12 million views. The caption read, Table 99. Eat the rich Mahashkama. The comments were brutal. Imagine treating Naomi Blackwood like that. R.I.P. to this lady's social life. I used to work for Margot St. James. She once fired me for making eye contact. Glad she's getting hers. Alexander Blackwood doesn't miss. I heard he bought the bank just to evict her. Legend. Margot dropped into a chair in the hallway, the marble floor cold beneath her slippers. The phone in her pocket buzzed again. It was the frantic wedding planner. Mrs. St. James, the caterers are threatening to sue. The check for the lobster bounced, and the florist is here with a crowbar demanding his vases back. Margot didn't answer. She stared at the open door where the bank agents were already placing property of the bank, stickers on the antique vases. She realized then that it wasn't just money. Alexander Blackwood hadn't just taken her house. He had taken her name. In high society, you can survive bankruptcy if people like you. You can survive a scandal if you have money. But if you have no money and everyone hates you, you cease to exist. While Margot's world was imploding in Newport, Julian Thorne was in Manhattan, trying to salvage his own. Julian was a senior portfolio manager at Apex Capital, a mid-sized hedge fund that prided itself on aggression. He was good at his job, ruthless, charming, and morally flexible. He assumed that, unlike his mother-in-law, he was safe. He hadn't said anything to Naomi. He had just stood there. Surely Alexander wouldn't burn an old childhood bridge over a seating chart error. He walked into the Apex offices on the 40th floor of the Rockefeller Center at 8:00 a.m. sharp. He needed to look busy. Morning, Sarah, he nodded to the receptionist. Sarah didn't look up. She was typing furiously. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice tight. Mr. Sterling wants to see you in the main boardroom, immediately. Julian frowned. Sterling was the CEO. He usually didn't come in until 10. Is it about the Q3 numbers? Julian asked, straightening his tie. He didn't say. Just go in. Julian walked down the glass corridor. He felt eyes on him. The trading floor, usually a hive of shouting and ringing phones, was strangely quiet. Traders were huddled in groups, whispering. When they saw him, they scattered. They saw the video, Julian thought, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. They know about the wedding. He pushed open the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. The room was vast, with a view of the Empire State Building. Sitting at the head of the table was Arthur Sterling, a man who looked like a bulldog in a suit. But Sterling wasn't alone. Sitting to his right, casually scrolling through a tablet, was a man Julian had hoped never to see again. Alexander Blackwood. Alexander wasn't wearing a tuxedo today. He was wearing a navy power suit that cost more than Julian's car. He looked fresh, rested, and utterly lethal. "Julian," Alexander said, not looking up from the screen. "You're late. Again." "Alex," Julian stammered, freezing in the doorway. I didn't know you had business with Apex." "I didn't," Alexander said, finally looking up. His eyes were devoid of the warmth they had held when he looked at Naomi. "Until this morning. At 4 a.m., my holding company, Blackwood Ventures, acquired a 51% controlling stake in Apex Capital." Julian looked at his boss. "Arthur, is this true?" Sterling looked defeated. He rubbed his temples. "They cornered the market, Julian. It was a hostile takeover. Efficient. Brutal. We didn't even see it coming until the ink was dry." "Why?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. He looked at Alexander. "Why would you buy a hedge fund just to fire you?" Alexander finished the sentence. He leaned back in the leather chair, tenting his fingers. "Oh, Julian, I'm not just going to fire you. Firing you would be too easy. You'd just go to another firm. You'd spin the story. You'd say it was a restructuring." Alexander tapped the table. "I'm here to audit you." Julian swallowed hard. "Audit? My numbers are solid." "Are they?" Alexander slid a thick file folder across the polished mahogany table. "Because my forensic accountants, who have been working since the reception ended, found some interesting discrepancies in the St. James Family Trust accounts that you manage." The room spun. Julian grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. "It seems," Alexander continued, his voice smooth and terrifying, "that you've been using client funds to prop up your mother-in-law's gambling debts. A little shuffling here, a little borrowing there. All very illegal." "It was a loan!" Julian cried, panic rising in his chest. "I was going to pay it back after the wedding gifts came in." "Embezzlement isn't a loan, Julian," Alexander said. "It's a felony." Sterling stood up, his face purple with rage. "You did what? You touched the client accounts?" "I had to," Julian pleaded, looking from Sterling to Alexander. "Margot was going to lose the estate. She threatened to cancel the wedding if I didn't help. Alex, please. We're friends. We built forts together in your backyard. Naomi wouldn't want this." Alexander stood up. The movement was so sudden that Julian flinched. "Do not," Alexander snarled, his voice dropping to a growl. "Say her name." He walked around the table until he was standing inches from Julian. "You're right. We were friends. And because of that, I expected something from you. Not money. Not a seat at the head table. I expected decency." Alexander poked Julian hard in the chest. "When Margot sent my wife to the kitchen, you watched. When she insulted her, you drank your champagne. You knew Naomi as the kindest soul on this planet. You knew she wouldn't fight back. And you let her be humiliated because you were too afraid of your mother-in-law." Alexander stepped back, adjusting his cuffs. "Cowardice has a price, Julian, and today the bill is due." Alexander turned to Sterling. "Arthur, I believe you have a protocol for rogue traders. Sterling nodded grimly. He pressed a button on the intercom. Security, send them in. 2 burly guards, not Frank, but men who looked just as tough, walked in. Escort Mr. Thorne to his desk, Sterling ordered. He has 5 minutes to collect his personal effects. No electronics, no files. Then escort him out of the building. And Julian? Alexander added, as the guards grabbed his arms. Julian looked back, tears streaming down his face. Alex, please. I've already forwarded the file to the SEC and the district attorney, Alexander said cold, checking his watch. They should be waiting for you in the lobby. I'd advise you to save your tears for the judge. As Julian was dragged out of the boardroom, sobbing, Alexander let out a long sigh. He looked at the stunned CEO. Arthur, Alexander said pleasantly. I'm appointing a new board of directors next week. Until then, stabilize the ship. Oh, and change the company name. Apex sounds too predatory. I was thinking something softer. Of course, Mr. Blackwood, Sterling said, wiping sweat from his forehead. What did you have in mind? Alexander smiled, a genuine smile this time. Call it EV Holdings. EV? Naomi Vance, Alexander said, walking toward the door. Since she's the only one with any integrity, we might as well name the company after her. Alexander walked out of the office, leaving a shattered career and a terrified executive board in his wake. He took out his phone. He had one more stop to make. The cleanup was almost done, but there was one loose end that needed to be tied up, and this one required a personal touch. 3 weeks had passed since the catastrophe at the Chateau de Lumière. The tabloids had finally moved on to a new scandal. But in Newport, the crater left by Alexander Blackwood was still smoking. Naomi sat in the passenger seat of Alexander's vintage Aston Martin as they wound their way up the coastal road. She wasn't wearing designer linen today. She was wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt, looking exactly like the woman Alexander had fallen in love with in a dusty library 5 years ago. You haven't told me where we're going, Naomi said, looking out at the ocean. Alexander smiled, keeping his eyes on the road. I had to handle one last piece of business regarding the foreclosure. Since you're the new owner of the property, I thought you should see it. Naomi sighed. Alex, I told you, I don't want the chateau. It smells like pretension and old money. I don't want a castle. I know, Alexander said, turning the wheel. That's why I didn't keep it as a castle. They pulled through the massive iron gates, the sign that used to read Chateau de Lumière. Private estate had been torn down. In its place was a simple, hand-painted wooden sign, the Table 99 Foundation. Naomi stared at it. What is this? Alexander stopped the car in front of the massive fountain where Margot had once screamed at him. But the scene was different now. There were no terrified waiters. There were no security guards checking lists. Instead, there were children running on the lawn. There were dogs chasing frisbees. And standing on the front porch, directing a team of movers carrying boxes of supplies, was a familiar figure in a uniform. It was Frank. Frank saw the car and jogged down the steps, a huge grin on his face. He wasn't wearing his tight, uncomfortable security blazer. He was wearing a polo shirt with the Table 99 logo. Mrs. Blackwood, Frank called out, opening her door. Welcome back. Naomi stepped out, bewildered. Frank, I thought you were in the Hamptons. Mr. Blackwood had a better idea, Frank said, winking at Alexander. He said you didn't want a summer home. He said you wanted to fix things. Alexander walked around the car and took Naomi's hand. Margot St. James used this place to exclude people, Alexander said softly. She used it to make people feel small. I bought the debt, Naomi. But the deed is in your name. And I authorized the renovations you talked about in your sleep that night." He gestured to the mansion. "It's not a wedding venue anymore. It's a transition center for families struggling with debt, for single mothers who need a safe place to stay while they get back on their feet, for staff who have been mistreated by their employers." Naomi covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. She looked at the grand ballroom through the open doors. The crystal chandeliers were still there, but the round tables with expensive linens were gone. Instead, there were long communal tables, computers for job hunting, and a play area for kids. "And the best part?" Frank said, pointing to the kitchen. The double doors swung open. Leo, the photographer's assistant, walked out holding a camera. But next to him was a woman in a chef's coat. It was Rosie, Margot's former housekeeper. "We hired the whole staff," Frank explained. "Everyone Margot stiffed on their paychecks. The caterers, the florists, the maids, they all work for the foundation now. Full benefits, union wages." Naomi walked up the steps, her heart feeling like it was going to burst. She walked into the service alcove, the place where she had been humiliated. The fern was gone. The folding table was gone. In its place was a bronze plaque on the wall. It read, "Here sat Naomi Blackwood. She taught us that dignity is not a dress code." "Do you like it?" Alexander asked, appearing behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Naomi turned and buried her face in his chest. "I love it." "Good." Alexander kissed the top of her head. "Because there's one last detail." "What?" "We needed a janitor," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Someone to scrub the toilets and handle the waste management. Frank insisted on a specific candidate. I think you might know her." Naomi looked out the window toward the rose garden, the same garden where the helicopter had landed. There, wearing a neon orange vest and holding a trash picker, was a woman. Her silver hair was frizzy, unkempt. Her face was devoid of makeup. She looked older, tired, and defeated. It was Margot St. James. "She needed a job," Alexander said simply. "No one else would hire her. Her credit is ruined, her friends abandoned her, and she has a mountain of legal fees. We offered her minimum wage. She took it." Naomi watched Margot stab a piece of litter with the stick, muttering to herself. Naomi could have gone out there. She could have gloated. She could have marched up to Margot and asked her if she knew her place now. It would have been satisfying, it would have been fair. But Naomi Vance was a teacher, and she knew that the best lessons aren't taught with cruelty. They are taught by example. "Let her work," Naomi said, turning away from the window. "But make sure she gets a lunch break. And Alexander?" "Yes?" "Make sure she doesn't have to eat in the back." Alexander smiled, a look of pure awe on his face. "You are a better person than I am, Naomi." "I know," she smiled, taking his hand. "That's why you married me. Now come on. Frank said Rosie is making burgers." They walked into the bustling, noisy, happy chaos of the main hall, leaving the empty silence of the high society world behind them. Naomi Blackwood had been asked to sit with the staff, and in the end, she realized it was the best seat in the house. Because at the end of the day, castles crumble, and money fades. But the way you treat people, that lasts forever. And that is the story of how one arrogant mistake took down an entire dynasty. Margot St. James thought that power came from where you sat at a table, but she learned the hard way that true power comes from who you are when you think no one is watching. Naomi didn't need a crown to be a queen. She just needed her dignity. And Alexander? Well, let's just say he proved that sometimes the nobody you insult is the one person who holds the keys to your future. What would you have done if you were Naomi? Would you have given Margot a job, or would you have let her rot? I really want to know. Let me know your savage or kind ideas in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and billionaire justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. We post new dramas every week. Thanks for listening, and remember, be kind to everyone, because you never know who just landed a helicopter on the lawn. See you next time.